honestly should have known better than to put Season 7 of SpongeBob on this survey. I mean, you guys seem to love me the most when I'm suffering mentally. Well, I can't even really blame you guys for that. I mean, it seems everyone prefers watching someone freak out over a cartoon than watching someone praise a cartoon. And now it's time for me to suffer in one of the worst ways possible. I have to review the season of SpongeBob that made up quite a chunk of my 2 worst SpongeBob episodes videos. Well, okay, I'm gonna be a little less cynical here. Yes, this season is terrible, but when you look at the fact that the staff had less time to polish their episodes, I guess you can't really fault them too hard. It doesn't take away from this being a terrible season, but I think I should remind my audience that no one is ever at their best when they're given less time and more pressure. And I guess there is a plus side to doing this. I've actually talked about a few of these episodes in other videos, so that means I more than likely won't be spending too much time reliving the pain they put me through, which is great because there's 50 episodes in this season. So yeah, safe to say there's going to be 5 parts of this seasonal review, all with 10 episodes each. So let's not waste any more time and let's see how bad this season really was. The first episode is Tentacle Vision, also known as Squid TV. And it doesn't matter what you want to call it, the outcome of this episode won't change. It's about Squidward getting his own television show, and SpongeBob and Patrick, and soon the whole city, ruin it. Now, one of the biggest issues with Season 7, and this is true for Season 6 and 8 as well, is the new writers seem to rely too heavily on making episodes where their characters, mostly Squidward, are suffering for basically no reason. And it's clear they didn't realize making him suffer in of itself wasn't funny, it was the situations that resulted in his suffering, most of which were caused by his own actions, that were funny. Luckily, this episode isn't by any means the worst offender of that. In fact, Squidward's suffering feels more like a secondary joke, and it seems like they were mostly trying to make an episode poking fun at how people act when they realize they're on television. But the thing is, it's boring! Everything these characters do is so uninteresting, unfocused, and drags on too long that you're more likely to remember the treatment it's giving Squidward by making all of these characters incapable of just fucking off. You eventually find them just as annoying as Squidward does, and I don't think that was the intent because you don't want your audience to be annoyed. That doesn't make for an entertaining episode. And the annoyance is capped off by Squidward getting kicked off of his own show, which isn't anywhere near as funny as it could have been because the majority of the episode is spent making the audience sympathize with Squidward as opposed to being entertained by his suffering. That being said, I wouldn't exactly call this episode god-awful. It more hinges on being forgettable, and I'll even admit I did laugh at a few of its jokes, despite them being very stupid jokes.
Oh yeah, I haven't made the coffee yet.
But honestly, I guess being a forgettable episode in a season filled with infamous ones is not exactly the worst you can do.
Now then, I was going to tell you about my fabulous...
Well, next up is I Love Dancing, or I Heart Dancing, whatever you want to call it. Now, this is interesting, because this episode actually gets what I went over when discussing Tentacle Vision. It's about SpongeBob getting noticed by a talent agent and getting an audition for a backup dancing gig, and Squidward conspires to steal it from him. Right there is what this episode does right. It's setting Squidward up to screw himself over by having him try to screw someone else over, instead of having someone else screwing Squidward over for no other reason than Squidward must suffer. Now this entire episode, SpongeBob either destroys some of Squidward's stuff, or outshines Squidward, making him feel more insecure about his own dance skills. But it works much better because it already established that Squidward isn't doing this out of the goodness of his heart. He's doing it because he wants to steal the audition SpongeBob earned fair and square. This episode is actually kind of like Artist Unknown, but it's more of a watered down version of that episode, which I guess isn't really that much of an insult, and the ending actually gives Squidward a fair punishment for his actions. Overall, this is one of the few Squidward suffering episodes from this season that actually gets it right. While I would still say as a whole, it's not a great episode, I mean, it does feel kind of repetitive after a while, I'd still say it's decent and actually worth a watch. While I think Artist Unknown is the better of these episodes, there's more than enough enjoyment to go around with this episode. Hell, it even gave us this classic line.
Who put you on the planet?
That's one of the few times SpongeBob makes a creepy face, and it's actually more funny than creepy. So, I guess that says a lot. I mildly heart this episode. And next we have Groat Spout. Now, like I said when I started, there's a few episodes from this season that I've talked about on other lists, and some of them I don't have that much to add to, and this is the first of those, but luckily this episode appeared on my top 10 best SpongeBob episodes from season 6 through 8 list. So, yeah, you already know I think it's a good episode. To sum it up, it's about Pearl going through a growth spout, and Mr. Krabs stealing food for her so she doesn't suffer. To sum up what I like about this episode, it makes Mr. Krabs look like he's doing what he's doing because he genuinely cares about his daughter, the cheapness of his character is actually used pretty effectively, and the ways Mr. Krabs steals food from people is hilarious. Mr. Krabs seems to be the character that's the hardest to not make unlikable because of his cheap nature, but this is one of the few times his cheap nature really worked out well for the episode. And it's still, in my opinion, one of the best from this time span.
What was that secret ingredient you used in there anyways, boy?
It was love, Mr. Krabs. It was love.
But now we move on to the infamous Stuck in the Ringer. Now, when I started out, I had intentions of making a solo review on this episode, but I ended up deciding against it because there's really not that much I can add to why it's such a despised episode. It's about SpongeBob getting stuck in his ringer and Patrick gluing him to it with forever glue, resulting in tons of pain and misery for SpongeBob. There's just so much wrong with how this episode is written and structured. I guess first off, yeah, it's an episode where Patrick is the main source of a character's misery, and while I wouldn't say it's the worst offender of that, it is in the top 5. I guess the episode is trying to make Patrick more blissfully ignorant, as opposed to deliberately malicious, but there are still some malicious vibes with Patrick's actions. That being said, Patrick's not the worst part of this episode. It's the ending that does this episode in. It's basically an earlier version of Little Yellow Book, because the Bikini Bottomites judge SpongeBob and say he deserves what he gets when he finally snaps at Patrick for constantly making his situation worse.
You deserve what you've gotten. Come on, we're out of here. Some people are just born mean. It's a sensitive.
Now I will say SpongeBob's snap feels a bit out of the blue, but it's not in a way that makes SpongeBob look bad. It's in a way that actually makes the episode's writing look bad. Because of Patrick gluing him to the ringer, SpongeBob gets kicked out of work, can't eat ice cream, and gets beaten up at the carnival. And most of the carnival stuff is at the hands of Patrick. And SpongeBob snaps at Patrick when he offers him cotton candy to cheer him up. And that's done to make SpongeBob look like he's in the wrong, but it doesn't because the flow of it is so terrible that you can tell the writers just did not know how to put this episode together. So when the Bikini Bottomites start judging SpongeBob, it's just so blatantly wrong that no one can really buy that SpongeBob deserved it. I would go as far as to call this one of the worst structured episodes of the show. In fact, the structure of this episode is so bad that it's honestly kind of fascinating. Like, you know there was no way the staff was finished with this script when they started making it. It feels more like ideas they were spitballing, but then they ran out of time so they hastily just put these ideas together. And I guess if you view it that way, it at the very least offers some fun you can have with it by picking out what ideas were clearly not supposed to be in the final script. But if you view it as a complete SpongeBob episode, then it's just an overall mess and one of the earliest indications of a very rushed season ahead.
I guess crying does solve your problems after all. Come here, buddy.
Well, at least we're together.
Now, I want you to notice the score of this episode is in red, and that's because this episode dipped below what I call the gem line on my gem scale, which means, thanks to this episode, I can finally talk about the significance of dropping below this line. Now, when an episode dips below this line, it basically means everything this episode got that was even remotely good was because it was so bad it was good. Hence why it's called the room area. Now, dipping below the gem line doesn't take points away. It's just another way to say this is an infamously bad episode. Like, people know about this episode all because of how bad it is. And when you watch it, you can see what they mean. With episodes like Tentacle Vision, they're too forgettable to go below this line. Also, going too far down this line isn't necessarily bad. In fact, anything past, I'd say a 5 on that side, starts becoming a guilty pleasure. Episodes you know are bad and can see why people find it bad, but you still find yourself enjoying them. Like, for me, New Bully on the Block from Hey Arnold, and Heavy Metal from the Loud House would be here. Episodes in the 3 and 4 range, those are episodes that I personally find terrible, but I know not many others will. For instance, I would put Proposition Infinity from Futurama here, because I know not many people despise it, but I think it's god-awful. And anything stuck in the 2 ranges, those are where episodes become problematic. That's the infamy section, and yeah, get used to seeing a lot of episodes in the 2 ranges for the seasonal review. And for the record, the closer you get to the gem line, the worse I think the episode is. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's move on to...
Oh, sure, why not?
Someone's in the Kitchen with Sandy. So, this is the first of a few episodes I discussed in my top 10 worst SpongeBob episodes list. And after careful consideration, it still belongs on that list. It's about Plankton stealing Sandy's pelt to steal the Krabby Patty formula, a la Imitation Crabs, and Sandy going through hell because of it, while the other characters are way too stupid to see that it's Plankton in the pelt. Like, so stupid they literally don't see it's him despite this.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm gonna leave it out here while I clean out the safe.
Now, this is another tactic they use quite a lot, making the characters much more stupid than they've ever been. Now, I'm aware SpongeBob doesn't follow continuity, and its universe has its own logic. However, it's ungodly lazy to use that as an excuse to write your characters like this. It's so easy to do, and it stands out badly. And using the cartoon logic excuse to justify this basically means you're saying you shouldn't be limited to following your character's characteristics, even though that's a big reason why people watch this show. They want to see the characters they like, not whatever dumbed down version you half-assedly put together just to fit the plot. I mean, when the main antagonist makes himself visibly noticeable to the 2 characters who see him the most, and they still can't tell it's him, that's the single worst bit of writing you can do, and it's something your audience is guaranteed to notice. That is the easiest way to make an infamous episode, when you take way too much liberties with the character's established characteristics to where they completely cease being the same character. And this episode is one of the worst offenders of that. The only positive thing I can say is that it's not the absolute worst offender of that, because SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs are more of a side gag, whereas the main focus is everyone harassing Sandy for being without her pelt. That's another issue too, when you make a character suffer for reasons that feel very poor. Like, fish that have the same amount of clothes on that Sandy does, still harassing her because she doesn't have her pelt on. I don't know if that's supposed to be a form of ironic humor though. Like, the humor is that these fish are too dense to realize that they themselves are in the same condition as Sandy. And if that is a form of ironic humor, don't you think it's a little too subtle? I mean, I always hear people defend any bad episode of this show by saying it's a kid's show and it should be judged as such. But if this is ironic humor, it's presented in a way that kids have no way of noticing, and I would assume that makes it more likely they won't enjoy seeing Sandy suffer this way. Contrary to popular belief, kids actually can tell when a character they like is mistreated, and they're more likely to not like the episode if they feel that way. Honestly, I've given this episode too much attention as is. I talked about it enough in this video, so let's just wrap this up here by saying this is an episode you can really see right through.
Public nudity is against the law in this county. But don't fret, you'll look just fine in prison orange.
Oh.
At long last, we move on to an episode that's actually good, The Inside Job. Now, I personally want to believe that episodes like Stuck in the Ringer and Someone's in the Kitchen with Sandy are episodes that the writers didn't spend a whole lot of time on because they were giving their time to episodes they had better ideas for. And this is one of those good ideas that really pans out well. It's about Plankton trying to steal the secret formula again, but this time he's trying to do it by sucking it from SpongeBob's brain. And you know what? That's actually a pretty good idea that you can get a lot of material out of. And they do. This episode has a bunch of creative ways of showing how SpongeBob's body works, and when Plankton starts fiddling with it, it results in some very humorous mess-ups.
Here it comes!
The secret to the Krabby Patty formula is...
Also, the design of SpongeBob's brain and how it works is very clever, as well as has a decent understanding of how the brain actually works, that it works in pretty subtly. Like Plankton going deeper into SpongeBob's brain to find the formula, which makes sense because he's metaphorically going into the temporal lobe, which is where memory is stored. And no, while I wouldn't expect kids to get that subtle joke either, the design of SpongeBob's brain is creative enough to where the kids don't actually need to get that joke, which is very similar to how a lot of the season 1 through 3 episodes were written. This episode is a more standout episode. It's got a lot of memorable jokes, and it does a decent job with this overused setup of Plankton trying to get the formula. I'd actually call this one of the better Plankton-centered episodes, top 10 for sure. And it's one that has a lot of rewatch value. An episode that stands high in a season of lows.
The secret recipe isn't in the brain, it's located in the heart. How cheesy.
Now we move on to Greasy Buffoons, which is about Mr. Krabs disposing of his backed up grease outside Plankton's restaurant, but Plankton decides to use it to make his food taste better, resulting in a back and forth between Krabs and Plankton, and who can make the tastiest and by far least healthiest food. Now this is one of those episodes I feel can go either way to most viewers. You'll either find the grease off between these two really entertaining, or too disgusting to get any kind of enjoyment out of. Personally, one issue I have with this episode is that it's got some very lazy and dragged out jokes. Here's one example.
Hey, look at that!
What?
There, right up there!
Where? I don't see anything.
A little to the right.
Oh, okay, I see it.
There's a new sign up at the Krusty Krab!
I mean, I think it's kinda obvious they needed to find a way to fill an extra minute, because they do that with quite a few jokes. But, to be fair, there are some jokes I find really clever too.
A job that only 2 volunteer employees could do for no extra pay.
And the grease war between these two, I do actually find somewhat entertaining, because clearly they're trying to poke fun at a lot of fast food restaurants that make their food as greasy as possible. Hell, if you've ever had an Egg McMuffin from McDonald's, you've probably noticed they have a tendency to do this.
Can't imagine what makes them taste so good.
So, I honestly got a nice amount of laughs from this grease off, and I guess overall, I would say this episode is fine. I don't think it's all that memorable, but it's something that I really wouldn't mind watching if it was on. But is it bad that this episode kinda makes me crave Egg McMuffins now?
Patrick, no!
Crunchity munchity.
Well, next up we have Model Sponge, which is about SpongeBob mistakenly thinking he's getting fired and setting out to find a new job, before getting a job in a sponge commercial, not realizing this commercial involves SpongeBob being used as a cleaning utensil. Well, first off, it's about time we got an episode that somewhat revolved around SpongeBob being used as a sponge. I mean, we've had side jokes about that and all, but very few episodes where he's actually used as one. And the scene where he's used to clean this disgusting bathroom feels like a decent little parody of made-for-TV products and how you can't always trust them. I mean, SpongeBob being able to take all this stuff off as easily as he is kinda shows that any real sponge can do what he's doing, and I find that kinda subtle, honestly. Downside, that's really the most enjoyable aspect of this episode, and it's like the last 2 minutes of it. The rest of the episode just involves SpongeBob freaking out over getting fired and trying to find a new job. There's even some jokes that really don't make too much sense.
Well, why don't you get a job as a billboard?
I don't think that's physically possible.
Not physically possible. Just get a little water in you. You could get a job as a skyscraper. Oh, I know what you're thinking. SpongeBob doesn't follow continuity. But in the same episode, they make this joke.
Just seeing which one of us is the little guy. And it looks like it is you.
No, I'm not.
Yeah, SpongeBob, if you can stretch yourself out like that, you could physically turn yourself into a billboard. Anyway, overall, this is another fine episode. I would say Greasy Buffoons is better personally, but Model Sponge does have its moments, and the last few minutes are enjoyable. But the episode still gives off a little too much of a filler vibe to me, kinda like the date from The Amazing World of Gumball. Not exactly a model episode, but a passable episode for what it is.
New sponge can make any toilet sparkle.
Well, next is Keep Bikini Bottom Beautiful, which is the first real episode of the season that takes the Squidward suffers for no reason trope to borderline infamous levels. It opens with Squidward happy because it's Sunday, which means he has the day to himself, and while taking a walk, he steps in gum and gets accused of littering by a cop, who, for the record, was just standing there the whole time and had to have seen what had happened. So he gives Squidward community service, and the rest of the episode is basically just Squidward constantly getting resentenced to community service. And there's a little bit of squillium thrown into this episode, which, okay, one positive thing, they kinda make good use out of his appearance, and another positive thing I can give it, it has somewhat of an understanding of how to do this trope right. But it still gets way too carried away with just making Squidward get penalized for a lot of stuff he has no responsibility for. And the way the cop just appears every time something happens, like, a part of me believes Squidward did something very cruel to this cop off screen, because he seems suspiciously blind to everything.
There. That should get you started. Ta-ta!
Yeah, again, I know it's the whole cartoon logic thing. Since the cop wasn't on screen, he didn't actually see what happened, but still, this cop just wears out his welcome so fast. Every time he shows up and the music plays, it's just so obnoxious and the episode relies way too much on it. Now, like I said, Squidward does, at times, do things where you're clearly supposed to find him unlikable, like stealing a little wagon from a kid. But they make the mistake of giving Squidward an understandable reason to do such a thing. The reason he steals the wagon is because he has no other place to put the trash he collected. And you know, if he doesn't dispose of it, he'll get sentenced to community service again. You can't really have Squidward do wrong, yet make the audience understand his reasonings, while still trying to write him as the one we're supposed to enjoy watching suffer. It really doesn't work like that. Honestly though, I do find this scene funny where Squilliam is mocking Squidward, but it's for a reason that's clearly not intended.
They've already built one. Of me! I cleaned up all of Bikini Bottom in only 1 week.
Oh, that's not you! That statue has no unibrow! That's Squidward all the way! The town gave Squidward a statue! How dare you try to steal that from him! And also, the ending is mildly enjoyable because it at least gives Squilliam his comeuppance, but it just goes so heavily overboard with Squidward's treatment that it's really hard not to dislike this episode. And if it wasn't for the ending and that obvious mistake of not putting a unibrow on Squilliam's statue, this episode would have easily dipped into infamous territories. But as it is, it's an episode that's just plain old bad.
I am angry.
Oh, so many bad episodes in just the first part so far, but plus side, there's only one episode left on this video, and really, what are the odds of it being worse than any of these? Oh, no! Okay, you know what? This is actually good. I'm getting a nice chunk of bad episodes out of the way with just this video, and that might make the next 4 videos not nearly as painful. Now, I've already talked about this episode in my top 10 worst SpongeBob episodes list. In fact, this episode topped that list. And you know what? It's still at the top of that list. This episode is about SpongeBob buying a new pet so Gary won't be lonely, and being absolutely ignorant to this pet setting out to try and kill Gary. Now, I was hoping to not spend as much time on this episode, but I want to give a more in-depth reasoning of why this episode failed by analyzing the defense for this episode, and that's the defense of "this is dark humor." And my response to that is, so? Dark humor or not, it's still a bad episode. Something being dark humor doesn't automatically make it good. There are many wrong ways to do dark humor. In fact, an example of dark humor being done right in this series is the episode Nasty Patty. Why? Because it doesn't rely on the cheapest and easiest writing tactics anyone can do. It doesn't take as much liberties as it can with its character's characteristics. In Nasty Patty, you actually see how SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs would behave if they thought they killed someone, and you actually believe this is how they would act. And that's hilarious because, 1, you never really think of the idea of them doing so, and 2, it's so dark but it still knows how far it can actually push it. Also, whenever they do hurt the health inspector, it's completely involuntary and still fits their characters. In fact, even though they attempt to do him harm at the start, it ends up actually having no effect on him. Clearly, a lot of thought went into how to execute this that it's actually pretty damn impressive. But the style of a pal for Gary is so easy to write an episode as. I mean, how hard can it be writing an episode for a show when you don't have to keep the characters true to their characteristics and can make them as ignorantly blind to what's going on as possible? I could do that right now with Nasty Patty, and I'll have the Alpha J Show read it, since this idea was actually inspired by his How I'd Write series, which you should check out. It's an awesome series. So let me present How I'd Write Nasty Patty in modern SpongeBob formats.
The health inspector surprises SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs for their health inspection, and finds the kitchen in a filthy state of disrepair, with grease all over the place. SpongeBob keeping frozen patties in his pants, which he says is to, quote, warm them up for the grill so that they don't have to take so long to cook when they're needed, end quote, and the vegetables soaking in the toilet, which Mr. Krabs tells them is to, quote, keep them fresh, end quote. The health inspector, obviously disgusted with his lack of health concerns, tells Mr. Krabs he'll be shutting down the restaurant, calling the kitchen the most disgusting thing he's ever seen before then going to slip on grease, slipping and sliding all over the kitchen, hitting everything, resulting in him getting knocked out. Mr. Krabs, thinking the health inspector is dead, celebrates this because now his restaurant can't be closed down, dragging SpongeBob along to go bury the body, with SpongeBob being blissfully unaware that this is what they're doing. A bubble transition cuts to them walking away, completely dirty with shovels in their hands, as Mr. Krabs tells SpongeBob if anyone asks. They were just gardening. But upon returning to the Krusty Krab, covered in dirt, with their shovels, two cops are shown waiting in a restaurant, completely oblivious to how SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs look, and ask for service. Mr. Krabs gives SpongeBob the shovels, and tells him to hide them in the freezer on top of the frozen Krabby Patties, and then fix up the cops some Krabby Patties themselves, which SpongeBob says he'll be able to do fast, because he still has some patties that he's been thawing out in his pants. The episode then cuts back to where the health inspector was buried, and his arm pops out like a zombie, and he walks back towards the Krusty Krab, battered and broken, in the rain. Upon arriving to the Krusty Krab, moaning and groaning with his arms out, SpongeBob screams out, "Zombie!" And when the inspector sees the cops, he says something like, "Oh, thank Neptune you here." These two try to, but before he can finish that sentence, he's knocked out by the cops, who think that he's a zombie. Before the cops realize that he's not a zombie, and that he's just an ordinary health inspector, the health inspector wakes up, but now has memory loss, and asks what happened, because all he remembers is coming to the Krusty Krab to give them their inspection. And basically after that, it's kind of fuzzy for him. Mr. Krabs would then tell him that he was about to give the Krusty Krab a passing grade for their health inspection, but he tripped over his shoelaces and hit his head. So SpongeBob and him took him to the hospital, and he must have just come back from there, and essentially passed the blame for his condition onto the cops. The health inspector believes their story and gives them a passing grade, and they all celebrate as Mr. Krabs slams the front door in the face of the injured health inspector, who lets out a slight moan in pain, ending this episode, which would have been called Health Hazard.
Yeah, see how much different that is from the original episode, and see how easy it is to write your characters in uncharacteristic ways, and have your characters ignore blatantly obvious things that are happening right in front of them, using the excuse of dark comedy? That's the biggest issue with this episode. It took way too many liberties with SpongeBob's character, and it does too many cruel things to a character that hasn't done anything, all because it thinks that's how dark humor is supposed to work. Not realizing what makes dark humor work is when the humor still manages to fit the character, and the misery the other character is suffering is mostly unintentional or has an actual purpose to it. This episode clearly has no idea how dark humor works, and the result is an episode that's so poorly written and so poorly thought out that it deserves to be considered one of the worst episodes of any show ever. And it's the first episode truly worthy of a 0 out of 10 from me.
Fluffy! Fluffy, wait! Well, Gary, what do you have to say for yourself?
Well, that's it for part 1, and good lord, what a bad start to a season. And the sad thing is, I already know there are many more bad episodes still to come. Well, at least I know they can't be worse than a pal for Gary. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next review.
Timmy would be very young enough to not speak in full coherent sentences. Timmy's parents would be talking until a furry creature appears out of the darkness for 2 days before it was realized that tons of factories were melting down by the second. Timmy would remember the rest of the cutscene and then feel bad for a few moments before shrugging it off.